Poštovane kolegice i kolege, želim vam dobar dan. Imamo danas izuzetnu priliku našeg dragog gosta, njegovu delegaciju, njegovu ekscelenciju, gospodina Wolframa Maasa, ambasadora Njemačke Republike u Srbiji. On će danas da se obrati i da održi određeno predavanje. O strukturi predavanja će reći profesor Voja Marjanović. Svi smo veoma zainteresovani da čujemo iz govora uvažene ekscelencije kako to da kada svi imaju problema u poslovanju, njemačka privreda i dalje napreduje, dokazuje da je vodeća u svijetu po kvalitetu, po strukturi. Ima puno kvalitetnih grana koje pokazuju izuzetne rezultate i rezultati njemačke privrede su pravi putokaz i za našu privredu. Nama je Njemačka najbitniji ekonomski partner budućnosti zbog svoga položaja i zbog svoje ekonomske snage i kvalitete rada. Duga tradicija poslovne saradnje, dobrih odnosa, nadam se da se nastaviti i ja bih zamolio Voju da vas upozna sa strukturom predavanja, a potom zamolio njegovu ekscelenciju da vas obrati i da svoju diskusiju.
Evo, zahvaljujem gospodinu rektoru. Znači, kao što i sam rektor kaže, danas je velika čast da na našem univerzitetu možemo da pozdravimo gospodina Maasa, ambasadora Savezne Republike Nemačke, našeg najznačajnijeg partnera u privredi, nadam se skorije, razgovarali smo oko nekih mogućih projekata u obrazovanju u budućnosti, nadam se da će do toga isto i doći. Pored mene je ovdje isto gospodin Štaker iz DAD-a, iz Nemačke službe za razvoj studenta, tako da će moći da odgovori, nadam se, na pitanja koja se tiču samog obrazovanja. Struktura samog predavanja gospodina Maasa će biti sljedeća. On će držati predavanje otprilike 15-20 minuta, ne više, na temu politička i ekonomska transformacija nakon pada Berlinskog zida, nakon završetka konflikta istoka i zapada, i nakon toga ćete moći da postavljate nekih dobrih 45-50 minuta pitanja. Znači, pitanja ćete moći da postavljate na engleskom ili nemačkom jeziku. Gospodin ambasador će govoriti na engleskom, neće biti simultanog prevoda i sva pitanja, znači, možete postaviti na engleskom ili nemačkom jeziku. Kad možete ne misliti da smo očili.
First of all, I would like to say a word of thanks to Dr. Marjanović for the preparation of this conference. I would like to say dobar dan to all of you, but that already completes the Serbian part of my presentation, because in all these years I still haven't managed to learn Serbian. I also would like to use the opportunity to wish you all a Happy New Year. Healthy one, but given your tender age, I think for you perhaps it's more important to have a successful one. And I'm very pleased to see here Dr. Stöckel, who perhaps is even more important as far as academic cooperation is concerned for you than I am, because he is the guy who is able to organize exchanges, cooperation for you with German homologs, and we just had a brief conversation, and there were quite a number of very interesting issues where the university has an eye on, and where I think the German Academic Exchange Service can be of help. I would like to thank you very much for the invitation, and I very much appreciate that we have such a turnout, and I'm afraid I will be a little bit longer than Dr. Marjanović had announced, and I'm awfully sorry that probably I will be the only thing between you and the celebration of the Serbian New Year's Eve. I'm looking forward to share with you some thoughts on the process of political and economic transformation after the end of the East-West conflict. With Germany and Serbia, we have two case studies which have to cope with the same challenge, transformation, but on a very different basis. Uniting Germany at the time didn't mean to join two entities on an equal footing, but it meant that a failed state acceded to an economically successful one. With the collapse of socialism, East Germany took over an established and proven set of laws, rules, and regulations. Nobody claims that the Federal Republic of Germany was or is a perfect state. But the system which had been applied politically and economically in the West over the decades had proven to be useful and successful. Of course, there has been some criticism among intellectuals, particularly from the East, that East Germany had been colonized by the West. You might perhaps remember the debate on then Chancellor Kohl's claim that East Germany would be transformed into blossoming areas. At that time, 20 years ago, he was ridiculed. Today, most of the complaints have disappeared. The system, broadly speaking, is working well. Of course, the regulatory framework has always to be modernized, to be improved, to be updated, and to be adapted to constantly changing circumstances. But in general, it is working well. And also, the perception is changing in a very positive way. Over 2 decades, on an annual basis, polls were taken asking the question, do you see these blossoming areas in East Germany? And in the beginning, the nays were outnumbering the ayes by a wide margin. But over time, like with a scissor, it closed. And just in time for the 20th anniversary of unification, the last poll for the first time showed that the ayes had it, that the people really perceive that the change has gotten there. And I think this is something we can truly be proud of. The situation in Serbia, as in most other Southeast European or East European countries, was different. The existing body of laws, rules and regulations had to be adjusted to the emerging new democratic political framework and to the new economic rules of a capitalist and more globalized world economic system. Thus, in a way, the challenges Serbia and other Southeast European countries were facing were much larger than those facing East Germany. What am I talking about concretely? What was it that facilitated East Germany's transformation? A few examples only. Let's, for example, in the political sphere, look at the political parties as the means for the formation and expression of political will, and at the role of the parliament in our system. After unification, or in the process of unification, the West German political parties reached out to the East. They merged quite often with existing parties in the East, using existing party structures. But the contents, the substance, was basically totally imported from the West. It was the structure which was made use of in the East, but the programs were the programs from the West. The work of East German members of parliament from the beginning was ruled by the regulatory framework designed for the West German Bundestag, our national parliament. East German members of parliament could immediately benefit from the influence the Bundestag had successfully fought for over decades. Additionally, a system of financing of political parties was in place that had evolved in Western Germany over decades. A system that had been adjusted and optimized after major scandals, which had laid open the shortcomings of some of the earlier stipulations. In Serbia, the struggle of parliament to attain and to secure the influence and powers the parliament should rightfully have is still ongoing. A new law on the financing of political parties is being worked on as we speak. The second most important aspect for a well-functioning political system are structures controlling the government, including a free and vibrant press, thus ensuring good governance. For example, from day one after unification, the influence of political interests and of the government on the judiciary was very limited. Thanks to the existing legislation in West Germany and thanks to the vigilance with which German courts, in particular the Constitutional Court, have ensured the implementation of the respective laws, we profit from a well-adjusted system of checks and balances. An elaborate system of administrative courts exists, now also serving East German citizens, to appeal also against decisions of the administration. A proven system of state agencies, but also of truly independent regulatory bodies, controls all aspects of life, including the work of the government and the administration. Just to name a few, like the Federal Competition Authority, the Anti-Monopoly Commission, the Federal Environment Agency, or the Ombudsman. These structures are complemented by a wide range of effective NGOs and watchdog organizations, like the Association of Taxpayers or others, which check into basically everything which raises the suspicion of the general public. All of that infrastructure existed for East Germany when they acceded to the Federal Republic of Germany. The freedom of press was guaranteed. That enabled the press to critically accompany everything that is going on, and in particular to comment all decisions of the government, including those concerning the details of the unification process. Freedom of the press is essential for every well-functioning democracy. There is no substitute. In Serbia, the judiciary reform is one of the major political undertakings of the present government. Much has been accomplished. Some things have to be put right. And the system then has to prove that it's up to the demands. Independent regulatory bodies have been created in Serbia Now the challenge is to enable their good functioning. They need the appropriate financing, sufficient staff, and responsibilities to do their job efficiently. As in so many cases in Serbia, the rule-setting process has to be followed up by implementation. Also, of course, the government has to make sure the recommendations and comments of these bodies are received with the appropriate attention and are implemented in everyday life. To complete a transformation process, of course, also requires to come to terms with the past, to assess the past, and to truly confront history in its entirety. To do that in itself is already a challenge. This is not made easier by the task to find solutions to questions like restitution and compensation. Quite frankly, I personally believe there is no totally fair and just solution. One can only try to engage in an honest and fair attempt. In Serbia, in that respect, many practical issues still wait to be resolved. The restitution question, or the question of school books in history classes, I would like to name just as a few examples. But I would also like to take a look at the economic sphere. One reason for the collapse of the GDR was undoubtedly its economic failure. An overwhelming part of the GDP of the GDR went into consumption. Almost nothing was left for investment. There was not enough to maintain the country's assets, not to speak of modernizing them. Infrastructure, enterprises, real estate were in a state of advanced dilapidation. The situation was even aggravated by the massive exodus of East Germans, many of them well educated, who didn't believe any longer in a politically and economically reformed and successful GDR. To move the two parts of Germany closer together, it was quite obvious that there was no alternative to a monetary union, and that as soon as possible. If the real money wouldn't come to the people would go to the money. But monetary union proved to be quite difficult. The question of the exchange rate became a very emotional and thus complicated one. An exchange rate in line with the market would have been approximately 1 to 4.5. But that would have meant that East Germans would have lost most of their savings, their salaries would have fallen beyond the line of poverty, and many other implications. On the other hand, an exchange rate of 1-to-1, as certain politicians started to call for, did not even roughly match the productivity in the GDR and would therefore cause higher inflation, a loss of jobs. Finally, as usual in politics, a compromise was found. Salaries, pensions, and so forth were exchanged 1-to-1, savings 1-to-2. This was definitely not ideal. In hindsight, I personally dare say it was probably even wrong. But it was a political decision, and under the given circumstances, there were not many alternatives. It was clear that a monetary union without an economic union would not work. This meant that the East German economy had to be restructured along market economic principles. State-owned companies had to be privatized. Price fixing had to follow the laws of supply and demand. A privatization agency, which was called Treuhandanstalt, was founded to oversee and govern this process. This process caused enormous pain for a lot of East Germans. They had hoped for a better life, and now they had to watch their enterprises being closed, their jobs being lost. But the productivity in East Germany was only around 1/3 of the one in the West. Most East German enterprises were hopelessly overstaffed. Motivation of the workers was due to a lack of incentive, often very low. Moreover, in particular to the set exchange rate, the East German economy lost more or less overnight most of its clients. Even East Germans preferred to buy West German products, and the clients in the former Eastern Bloc could not afford anymore to buy East German products, as they had become far too expensive due to the above-mentioned exchange rate. Unemployment became an ever-growing problem. Many people met for the first time in their lives with social hardships. And till today, we have areas in East Germany where unemployment is reaching close to 20%. It's these days that for the first time we experience a very significant drop in unemployment rates. It's for the first time in almost 20 years that unemployment is overall in Germany getting below the mark of 3 million unemployed. Of course, the social security system of the former West Germany was in place now also in the former GDR. Huge amounts of money flew from Western Germany to the east. At times, the amount on a yearly basis was 150 billion marks. Tremendous amounts of money. But it almost totally went into consumption. It didn't go into investment. But still, many people were dissatisfied with the situation. What they had hoped for was social security, as they had known in the GDR, with a guaranteed workplace, free health insurance, and so forth, but on a much higher level. They were not prepared to compete in a contested marketplace. And now they found themselves jobless, many of them, especially the older ones, without any chance for a new start. One also has to be honest, the remaining enterprises, and some newly founded ones, were led often by experts from the West. Many, as I said, criticized this as Western colonialism. But there was no real alternative due to a lack of expertise in this special field in the East. And one has to admit that some Westerners recklessly took advantage of the lack of experience in the GDR. Adventurers saw the former GDR as a kind of bonanza, where one could make money the easy way. Many of them acted, although legally, yet immorally. Without any scruples, they used loopholes in the legal system. Nobody had thought of such a possibility, as there was no kind of blueprint for such a situation. We had talked about unification for 40 years, but there was no plan. In the East, the ownership structure had to be restructured. As I said, from state ownership to private ownership. This sounds easy, but proved to be very difficult. First of all, there had been different phases of expropriation. The Nazis had already taken away property from certain segments of society. A Soviet wave of expropriations followed after the Second World War, and an East German one later on. The German government at the time of unification claimed that the Soviet one had to be accepted due to the political circumstances. A claim which is contested till today and which laid the base for many misgivings concerning the whole process. The GDR expropriation phase had to be somehow revised, but it had to be a revision without causing too much new injustice. In the end, it was decided that restitution should come before compensation. This caused a lot of anxiousness. First, East Germans were afraid of greedy Westerners taking their homes away, where they had been living for 40 years. But in the end, after 20 years of unification, I think it's fair to say, in the end, it more or less worked satisfactorily, and even more so as there were numerous exceptions to the rule. All in all, the process of restructuring the East German economy was, from my point of view, dealt with in a way that nowadays it hardly creates any more problems, even if some question marks still persist. The process was difficult, it was bitter at times, but it was the only way out of a paralyzed, non-competitive economic system that had not only choked the people's own initiative, but had harmed the environment to an extent that was unimaginable. Change and transformation had been inevitable. The question, of course, is, are there lessons to be learned from the German experience? First of all, the transformation after the end of socialism was a tremendous task. It took and still takes a long time. As in East Germany, despite its excellent starting position compared to the rest of Eastern Europe, the transformation has not yet been completed. And quite openly, the need for reform will never end. We always will have to adapt to a changing world. And the change in mentality is a generational challenge. Secondly, transformation affects all parts of life. Politics, economy, education, and the social system. That is a fact, just as much as it is a fact that there is no alternative to major reform. If you avoid necessary reforms today, the country will run only into deeper crisis tomorrow. The people will end up being still poorer and less able to lead a decent life. And what is perhaps even more important, people will lose hope and perspective. Thirdly, transformation is no free lunch. Transformation costs. There are winners and losers in transformation. The German example has shown that the influence of the government in it is limited. even the best government cannot shield the people from all hardship. The government's task, in my view, is to limit the hardship to the best of its abilities and to set the legislative frame that enables a further prosperous and just development of the country and society. In Serbia, the first years of possible transformation were wasted. The Yugoslav wars prevented the implementation of major reforms and offered an excellent opportunity for the creation of criminal and questionable structures by crooks and thieves which haunt the state till today. In one of my first encounters when I came to Serbia 3 years ago, I had a meeting with former Foreign Minister Svilanovic, and he told me at that time, see, in 1988, Yugoslavia was called upon to make a decision. And it made a wrong decision. If it would have made another decision, by today, Yugoslavia as a whole would long be a member of the EU, and many problems we have today would long been dealt with or would perhaps even never have occurred. I will never forget that conversation, and it sort of accompanies me on a daily basis when I'm dealing with issues which concern your country. But knowing about that is one thing. You cannot rerun history. It's a done deal. You have to cope with the today and the tomorrow. And in that respect, I think, although in the past perhaps too little attention has been paid to the economic and social development in Serbia, I perceive a clear change since the summer of 2008, where this country got a new government with a very clear perspective towards the EU. And they declared the necessity to bring about real changes and necessary reforms. Dear students, members of the faculty, I'm fully aware that I'm claiming that the process of reform has only begun. But I think there are good news. Much has been achieved, I think, since over the past 2.5 years. Your president has promised that 2011 will be a year of diligent work on reforms. And most importantly, Serbia is not alone. The EU and the EU member states support Serbia substantially. Much of the consultancy work offered by the EU and the financial support to Serbia by the EU is used to promote necessary steps in the transformation of your country. Germany alone, since the year 2000, has made available close to 1 billion euros, not considering more than 400 million euros as part of the EU support, to which Germany also contributes. After the presentation of the progress report on Serbia by the EU Commission, President Tadic welcomed the report by saying that the EU was something like the collection of best practice and experience with respect to state organization, and should just thus serve as a model for Serbia. It's perhaps a little bit exaggerated. I'm always very cautious if terms like best and something like that is concerned, but at least it's probably the best we have available right now. And thus, for Serbia, the direction of the necessary reforms is quite clear. There's broad support by the EU, and there's the young generation, that means you, to pressurize your government to continue this transformation in the interest of yourself and your children. The EU is not coaxing you into anything. The EU is making an offer which has worked well for an increasing number of members for now more than 50 years. You are invited to become part of this club. Tomorrow begins the Serbian New Year. Make the best of it.
Zahvaljujem se gospodinu ambasadoru. Kao što sam najavio, znači sada je predviđeno vreme za pitanja, pa bih ja zamolio publiku da li neko ima neko interesantno pitanje da postavi ambasadoru i gospodinu, što je Leo, koleginica Marina se javi. Izvolite.
Sehr geehrte Exzellenz, vielen Dank für diese wichtige und interessante Präsentation. Es freut mich, dass Singidunum Universität mit Deutsche Botschaft eine gute Zusammenarbeit etabliert hat. Und ich habe eine Frage für Sie. Deutsche Direktinvestitionen sind sehr wichtig für Serbien. So, es interessiert mich, welche Branchen in Serbien sind die Prioritäten für die künftigen deutschen Direktinvestitionen sind. Danke sehr für die Antwort. Samo da kažem na srpskom, htjela sam prosto da uvažim ambasadora i da postavim pitanje na nemačkom. Pitanje je vezano za direktne strane investicije u budućnosti, posebno za prioritetne oblasti koje Nemačka posmatra kao budućnost svojih direktnih stranih investicija. Hvala.
Thank you very much. I hope you don't mind if I continue to speak in English. Of course, I very much appreciate to be addressed in German, and it makes my life so much easier. But it makes your life more miserable because you have to say what you want to say twice. And so I stick to English. Of course, you are absolutely right. Foreign direct investment will be an important part of any economic development of this country. If you look at the foreign trade balance of this country, if you look at the in and outflows of funds to and from this country, it's very clear that if you want to have progress, you have to work hard to become a sought-after investment destination. And you see, I always try to be as straight and honest as possible. It's a simple fact that in the past there was an image problem for Serbia. If people were thinking of Serbia, they were thinking of the 90s. And so the first challenge is to change this perception. And I think Serbia is doing a very good job in accomplishing that. But nevertheless, once again, it's something affecting the mind, and that takes time. But, and you might perhaps laugh, but I think it's important that even single events, processes, people, which you perhaps might consider not so important, happen to change this perception. For example, it's now 2 years ago when we had the Eurovision Song Contest. We had alone 140 journalists from Germany coming. And they were amazed about what they saw. By the fact, it's something I experience on a daily basis with visitors. When I escort a visitor to the airport to see him off, my routine question is, and what is your perception of Serbia? And the answer, and I never got another one in 3 years, is it was so much different from what I expected. So Serbia basically is on a very good path. And for example, if you win the Davis Cup, this is very positive because it attaches a new image to Serbia. Even if you beat us 1-0 in soccer, it is good for Serbia. And it didn't do so much damage to us. Okay. So I think this image thing is very important because business people, then if they think about investment, they have a number of options. And if they look down the page and there are things which they associate with something negative, they just move on to the next. And therefore it's important that they at least think about Serbia. And we experience that this process is getting into motion. And into this process, of course, aside from these image things I was referring to, it's also important that more and more German businesses who are active in this country report back that things are okay. No one from, and we have a German Business Association in Belgrade which has close to 250 members, I think. And no one will say, oh, we can pluck the money from the trees. They have to work for it. But 87%, we do an annual survey, and always in March, last March, 87% said they would come again. And that is a good message. And although it started like a trickle, over the 3 years of my working here, I have experienced an increase of this trickle. It's not a flood yet. I would love it to become a flood, but we are working on that. And for example, last year we had a number of German companies who set up shop here. And also for this year, we have already companies in the pipeline. These are not mega projects. These are not companies which set up a shop for 10,000 or 5,000 people. But it's companies who set up a shop for 500, 600, 300, 150, whatever. But in totality, it adds up. And quite frankly, I strongly believe from our German experience that for a well-working economy, it's much more important to be very broadly based instead of depending on one or two big white elephants who are fine as long as they can march on and who create big problems the moment they get stumbling, you know. And therefore, the areas of investment here are very widespread. Of course, we have a strong leg in automotive industries. We have quite a number of companies who are delivering parts to car manufacturers in Europe, which, given the economic situation these days, is probably not such a bad thing. 2 years ago it was a little bit different. But we have additional companies coming here, and I'm quite optimistic that we can build on what we had here. We also have investment is Himmelfahrt. pharmaceuticals. Not an easy market, sometimes problems, but Stava, the mother company, is very determined to make it a success, and I'm optimistic that they will follow through. Another big investment is Metro. They are building one market after the other. They have now managed to be the number 2 German investor in this country. And to me, Metro is of particular importance because the boss of Metro happens to be the chairman of the Committee of German Industry, which is dealing with Eastern Europe. So if he, with his company, is pleased with Serbia, I count on, let's say, a good image for Serbia in this core lobbying group for German business. So aside from, you can buy your stuff everywhere, but in this particular combination, Metro to me is very important. We also have, for example, here companies like Messertechnikas, which are not serving the wider public. They are specialized companies, but they are here for 20 years or longer, have been here through all the ups and downs of your country, and still proclaim that overall it was worthwhile and they would come again. So it's a wide variety of companies, but just because you asked for it, the investments of last year, which we had, are of such a wide range, like, for example, building materials like windows for houses, chemistry, like Henkel, I mentioned trade, like Metro, textile, like Falco, they are producing socks, if you need some good socks, I can recommend them. Car parts, I already mentioned, we had different companies last year. And we are also in the process, I think next month, we will open an expansion of Fresenius, which is also in the medical field. So it would be difficult to say it's one sector alone. It's really widespread, and quite frankly, I'm happy that it is that. Yeah.
Your Excellency, Mr. Maas, I have one question. What happened with big industry in East Germany after reunion, like Tarkrat, Bauchem, Limex, etc.?
No, as I mentioned already, they ran into tremendous difficulties. They had been catering basically to the Eastern European market. And the moment unification was brought about, of course, everybody expected that more or less that would go on, and in the process, they would modernize and become even more successful. Basically, a sound idea. But as I said, the execution was perhaps not perfect, because we started with this exchange rate thing, which immediately priced them out of the market. And that is the effect of the exchange rate. You from one day to the next raise wages in a company to the by the factor 4 or 5, you can imagine you are no longer competitive. And if you then offer products at a Western price, but still coming with Eastern technology, then the people went straight to the West. And therefore many of the big established companies in the East simply came into huge difficulties or even faltered. But they are not all gone. For example, Takraf, which you mentioned, they are still down there in what is it, Kolubara, there they are setting up the cranes for the coal mining and so forth. It took a while, but they took the turn. And in the meantime, of course, also, let's say, this inadequacy of structure and costs has more or less been overcome. I think nowadays a business in the East, in its framework, is no longer different from one in the West. And in certain aspects, they even have advantages, because I mentioned the tremendous amount of money which was passed on from the West to the East. Okay, most of them, as I said, went into consumption, but part of it also went into investment. And if nowadays you travel in Germany, you will find no more modern highways than in the East. If you would dig up the telephone infrastructure, you wouldn't find more modern telephone infrastructure than in the East. These things which have been newly installed are truly state-of-the-art. We have many complaints now in Western regions, which of course had to cut short their expenses to make the funding available, and they claim now we have to be helped. In Germany, still every citizen who pays taxes, and we make it a habit that everyone who earns money pays taxes, has to pay an additional 5.5% of his income tax to pass on to the east of Germany to help the transformation process. So, as I said, it's not over yet, and it will take a long time, but we have now areas in the West where they say, sorry, we still are paying this kind of money, and it goes to the east, but they are much more advanced now than we are. We want to be helped too. So I guess on average things have been brought into a certain balance, and also the industrial situation has, let's say, a sound perspective. And we even have regions where the East nowadays is leading. If you, for example, take the chip industry, they talk about not Silicon Valley, but Silicon Saxony, because in the area around Dresden, you now have the major chip producers of this world with factories down there which are very successful. So, as I said, it's not over yet, but it's on a very good way.
I have two questions for you, Mr. Maas. I have a question for you to ask you. Because of all respect, I have for you, and especially for the country you come from, my questions will be also in German. Herr Botschafter, vor etwa ein paar Jahren habe ich in Deutschland ein sehr interessantes Buch unter dem Titel Auf dem Weg zur deutschen Einheit vom westdeutschen Ex-Bundeskanzler und Finanz- und Verteidigungsminister Helmut Schmidt gelesen. Und in diesem Buch schreibt er unter anderem über 7 Kardinalfehler der Wiedervereinigung Deutschlands. Und als seine größten Fehler erwähnt er den Umtauschkurs zwischen Mark Ost und D-Mark West. Sie haben schon darüber gesprochen, aber im Buch schließt sich ein zahlenmäßiges Beispiel. Ein sehr bekannter ostdeutscher PKW-Personenkraftwagen Trabant hat von dem Umtauschkurs etwa 14.000 D-Mark gekostet, die Tanke. Und nach dem Umtausch 14.000 D-Mark West. Und ich möchte, also für dieses Geld konnte man natürlich ein besseres Auto im Westen kaufen, ein Ford Fiesta, Opel Corsa und so weiter. Und ich möchte Ihre persönliche Meinung dazu hören. Und war das eine populistische Maßnahme vom westdeutschen Bundeskanzler damals Helmut Kohl im Vorfeld der gesamtdeutschen Bundestagswahl? Das ist die erste Frage, die sich auf wirtschaftliche Transformation bezieht. Und die zweite Frage geht an Herr Karl Herbert Frahm alias Willy Brandt. Ich möchte Ihre persönliche Meinung auch dazu hören, was hat der Kniefall also in Warschau im Dezember 1970 zum Versöhnen zwischen Deutschland und Polen also bedeutet. Walter Scheel und später Hans-Dietrich Genscher haben bestätigt, dass dieses Ereignis bzw. dieses Vorgehen ganz spontan war, nichts vorgeplant. Und ich möchte Ihre persönliche Meinung dazu hören. Also in Kürze zu übersetzen, pitao sam gospodina ambasadora ukratko 10 sekundi šta misli o kursu, o razmjeni između istočne marke, znači istočno-nemačke marke i zapadno-nemačke marke, pošto se smatra da je to najveća greška ujedinjenja Nemačkih. Da li je to bila populistička mera Helmuta Kohla pred sve nemačke izbore 90. godine? I drugo pitanje ukratko, šta je značio za Nemačku i za Poljsku to, znači, posjeta Willy Brandta Varšavi i Getovu, moment kad je on kleknuo pred tim spomenikom, šta je to kasnije značilo faktički za odnose Nemačke i Poljske? Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much for your nice effort in my language, which was perfect, but nevertheless it must have had something to it which escaped me because you have created such a reaction in the audience, whatever. The two questions. First of all, former Chancellor Schmidt is very great in enumerating cardinal mistakes. And why shouldn't he come up with a list of major mistakes with unification? I think I tried to be honest in my presentation, in not hiding that the process was far from perfect. And one of the reasons, of course, was, as I said, we always talked about it, but we never prepared for it. And so when it came about, and it's enlightening to read some interviews nowadays of people who were very closely involved in the negotiations which then took place. We are amazed how spontaneous certain things develop. And we shouldn't forget, I truly believe that the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was a simple misunderstanding. A guy in a press conference was asked a question, and he had gotten his instructions wrong. And so he claimed something, he declared something, which created a reaction which could never be stopped again. I do not believe that there was an intention to open the wall on the evening of the 9th of November, 1989. Mr. Schabowski simply misunderstood his speaking notes. But I don't know, you are all so young. You perhaps have not the memory. I was glued to the tube in that night. For 12 hours I didn't move. There was a process underway which only could have been stopped at that time by violence. And luckily, no one resorted to violence. And then suddenly, a development was underway, which in the end, luckily for us, brought about unification. But totally unplanned and totally unprepared. And therefore, of course, mistakes have been made. And you pointed out to this nice example, evidently in this book, which I don't know, but it exactly illustrates what I was talking about. If you, from one day to the other, have the same product structure, but a different cost structure, which goes by the factor of 4 or 5. Things simply will not match anymore. And this, as students, you probably learn in the first semester of economics. And if you talk about former Chancellor Willy Brandt, I want to make it very clear here. We have to have tremendous respect for this man and his accomplishments during his life. And that shouldn't be diminished or ridiculed by anything. And then he went to Poland. I don't know whether you can imagine. I haven't been there. I haven't been in these circumstances. But for example, I travel in this country. I'm invited to memorial services of atrocities which we committed during the Second World War. And when I come to these places, I cannot be there emotionally untouched. Of course, it's something which goes very deep. And therefore, I can fully understand that he, being there, was overwhelmed by the situation, and that it was a very true and genuine gesture of regret and asking for, or presenting an apology, or asking for belief, or whatever you want to call it. And I think this is what I talked about when I was referring to confronting the past. This is not easy. You see, I'm born 1950, but it took till the middle of the 60s, till in my country an open public debate started about what had been done in the German name during the war and during the Nazi period. And it was not pleasant. Until today it's not pleasant. But we have to deal with it to prevent it from happening again. And Willy Brandt, in that respect, made a tremendous contribution so that we will always remember and try to do something else. And we should also not ignore that he, although he was long out of office, was among the first when the wall fell and when many in his party, of course realizing the tremendous economic burdens which would be heaped on the West, advocated to go it slow and perhaps to leave them to themselves and what have you. And he stood up and said, now it's drawing together what belongs together, and by saying that, shifted the tone also in his party. So I think at many stages in his life, also against the background of his personal experiences, personal circumstances, he made a very important contribution that the world perceived that there is truly something like a new Germany. And so I think although he was no longer an acting politician, we owe him also for his contribution in preparing the way also for the acceptance of unification. Because we shouldn't forget that. And perhaps it's worthwhile to read a little bit about it. What the thinking was in the chancelleries of the powers, not only in Moscow, but also in London, in Rome, in Paris. There were no cries of joy when the wall fell. But because people like Brandt had conveyed this image of a changed Germany, it was possible for Helmut Kohl not only to convince Gorbachev, but also Mitterrand. I think Thatcher he never convinced, but that didn't count in the end. that they had to agree to unity. So he had played a tremendous role.
Da li ima još pitanja? Evo, gospodin, samo...
Do we have a
Evo, aha.
microphone?
Hohe Exzellenz, Herr Botschafter, zunächst einmal einen schönen guten Tag. Und ich möchte gerne fragen, ich denke, das ist doch die Frage, die sich wie jeder stellt, wann wird Serbien ein Teil der Europäischen Union? Es sind riesen Erwartungen da. Die politische Spitze ist mittlerweile seit 10 Jahren auf dem Weg. Es ist ein riesen Wille da. Und was denken Sie, was ist Ihre Meinung, wann wird Serbien ein Teil der Union sein? Vielen Dank.
Das ist die Frage, oh, sorry. That is the question I get at least 3 times a week. And for 3.5 years I have refused to give a definite answer, and I do not give a definite one right now. But I would like to make some statements which shed a little bit of light onto that. First of all, Serbia is not on the path to the European Union for the past 10 years. Serbia is on the path to the European Union for the past 3 years. The government of President Kostunica Prime Minister Kostunica made no serious effort to move towards the EU. To the contrary, Djindjic wanted to move to the EU. I knew him when he was still an opposition politician, and he had talks in the German parliament. And I last met him 5-6 months before he was assassinated, when he paid a visit to Washington, where I was serving at that time. And I asked him at that time about these big problems which had to put out of the way. And in his answers, he was very encouraging that although he hadn't a detailed plan, but he was very determined to clear the path so that the country could focus on the EU. And I think with his assassination, all this was more or less brought to a standstill. And it's only since the summer of 2008 that there is a clear decision in this country, we want to go there. And this is not only a decision by the government, we fortunately, luckily I say, now have a situation that in Serbia all relevant political forces agree on that. There are only some fringe groups who have a problem, but the mainstream of the political decision makers in this country want Serbia to move to the EU. And I can tell you one thing, and I said that we want Serbia in the EU. The point to me is not so much in a date. To get to the EU, you have to be ready. And this is something which also has to be communicated to the people. And I think much more effort can be invested in that. To get to the EU, I've made this reference to the quote of President Tadic. It's true. What we call the acquis communautaire, a set of rules and regulations which sort of rule the EU. It's perhaps not perfect. It's perhaps even over-bureaucratic because it's a compromise of now 27 countries. But it's the best blueprint we have for a modern state in Europe. And therefore, to adapt to these rules and regulations, this is the big challenge. And even if Serbia would not want to go to the EU, I'm absolutely convinced that to be a modern country, a country with a prospect to its citizens, it would need to implement basically what is in this acquis communautaire. And Serbia is doing that. Every day, the government, the parliament, the administration, they are working on getting closer by the day And this is what counts in this process, because everything which is implemented there will contribute to a better life of Serbian people. And then, at a certain point, the circumstances will be there that everybody says, okay, close enough, now we can sign the accession agreement and you become a member. But I think it doesn't matter so much whether it's a year earlier or a year later. And it very much depends. You see, look at what the experiences of other countries. Some took a little bit longer, some were faster. I personally believe that given the determination and the capacities of this country, Serbia can go through the motions faster. But once again, to go through the motions is the important thing, because on the way, the situation for Serbians will already change, and that is what counts in the end. So, therefore, you will not hear a date from me, but I can tell you, we want Serbia there, and I am personally even convinced, you see, on such a way, it's not marked, but somewhere you pass the point of no return. Much later you will only realize that you have passed. I'm pretty convinced that Serbia has already passed this point. I have said this publicly and I repeat it here also. The only one who can prevent Serbia from becoming a member of the EU is Serbia itself. If Serbia would decide not to join, but within the EU there is no one objecting. But we have to keep one thing in mind, and this perhaps contributes to a misunderstanding. Minister Jeremic and people of his ministry quite often, they challenge me and say, oh, we are held to much stricter rules and regulations than anybody else. And my constant answer is not true. You are held to the same requirements which were laid down in Copenhagen, I think it was in 1995. Where you are right is that in the past 10 years we have had experiences with new members, and we have accepted countries in the EU which were not mature yet. Last week we had the Serbian Ambassadors Conference, and the guest speaker was the Slovak foreign minister who represents a country which only 7 years ago joined the European Union. And I was amazed to hear him say, although I fully subscribe to it, we took in countries which were not prepared enough. That was a mistake, and this mistake will not be repeated. In that respect, there will be no longer decisions out of political opportunism to take someone in who isn't there yet. But this is an issue of time, not an issue of whether you get there or not.
Evo, mi se zahvaljujemo gospodinu Masu što je odvojio svoje dragoceno vreme da posjeti naš univerzitet. Mi se iskreno nadamo da sa ovom posjetom saradnja između nas, ambasade Savezne Republike Nemačke i Nemačke neće biti završena, da ćemo raditi na projektima po pitanju dolaska nekih nemačkih profesora kod nas, po pitanju saradnje našeg univerziteta i drugih nemačkih institucija. Još jednom hvala i svim studentima što su izdvojili svoje vreme da prisustvuju predavanju.